Spain. For glory, for gold.
But it was far worse than that. They used to cut their hands and their feet off as well.
They did. And once these bodies were rolled down,
let's see where the copper was. Melt it down. Turn into plasma and fuse with glass. Only does that done cutting down. Some copper. You get around. inside. Continue work on the outside. Make it watertight. Structurally sound. Me? Yeah. Add some bakeware glass to it so it's super strong. That's crazy. That's the first time I ever heard this song or seen the screen of this. But I drew out that with the explanation of the energy waveform of the planet between the two. In Old Iroquois, Old Block Hebrew, Aramaic, upper part and lower part. It's in my writings or notes on Facebook. It's crazy. Wow. Eye-opener. Done cutting the ingots. For the weld. Exoskeleton. Plasmatized copper into it. The cage that was inside has been melted to the glass. This will be on the outside. And the bakeware glass, harder silica. I use that. Going live. I'm not sure, cousin. You saying that to me yesterday. I didn't know your brother was killed. I tried calling you. You didn't answer. Today is the day of the Keshe group shit. Remember, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays. Keshe Foundation. They do their space stuff today. Or reactor group shit.
City emergency units have come to a limit, not only in Madrid, that is the epicenter of the epidemic in Spain, but also in some other regions. So the big picture is really bad in Spain, and we are waiting we had good news because yesterday and today we had received loads of gear, so that has been supplied to several regions of Spain. So let's see if things change for them in a few days.
Italy has held a minute's silence to remember its victims of coronavirus. 812 new deaths were reported on Monday. That reverses a 2-day downward trend. Italy is the hardest hit nation with more than 11,500 deaths and more than 100,000 people infected. We're off to the UN headquarters in New York. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, is speaking right now. Let's listen in.
COVID-19 is causing in all regions. The magnitude of the response must match the scale of the crisis. Large-scale, coordinated and comprehensive, with country and international responses being guided by the World Health Organization. And it must be multilateral, with countries showing solidarity to the most vulnerable communities and nations. The message of the report we are issuing today is clear. shared responsibility and global solidarity in response to the impacts of COVID-19. It is a call to action. First, for an immediate coordinated health response to suppress transmission and end the pandemic. A response that scales up health capacity for testing, tracing, quarantine and treatment while keeping first responders safe, combined with measures to restrict movement and contact. A response that delivers universal access to treatment and vaccines when they are ready. It is essential that developed countries immediately assist those less developed to bolster their health systems and their response capacity to stop transmission. Otherwise, we face the nightmare of the disease spreading like wildfire in the global south, with millions of deaths and the prospect of the disease re-emerging where it was previously suppressed. Let us remember that we are only as strong as the weakest health system in our interconnected world. I am particularly concerned with the African continent, and I strongly encourage the G20 to move ahead with the G20 Africa initiative as proposed at the summit. Second, we must tackle the devastating social and economic dimensions of this crisis with a focus on the most affected: women, older persons, youth, low-wage workers, small and medium enterprises, the informal sector and vulnerable groups, especially those in humanitarian and conflict settings. We must see countries not only united to beat the virus, but also to tackle its profound consequences. That means designing fiscal and monetary policies able to support the direct provision of resources to workers and households, the provision of health and unemployment insurance, scaled up social protection, and support to businesses to prevent bankruptcies and massive job losses. What is needed is a large-scale, coordinated and comprehensive multilateral response amounting to at least 10% of global GDP. Developed countries can do it by themselves, and some are indeed doing so. But we must massively increase the resources available to the developing world by expanding the capacity of the International Monetary Fund, namely through the issuance of special drawing rights and the other financial international institutions, to rapidly inject resources into the countries that need them. Coordinated swaps among central banks can also bring liquidity to emerging economies. And debt alleviation must be a priority, including immediate waivers on interest payments for 2020. The United Nations system is fully mobilized, providing guidance for global efforts, supporting country responses, and placing our supply chains at the world's disposal. And to support our efforts, the United Nations is establishing a new multi-partners trust fund for COVID-19 response and recovery to support low and middle-income countries to respond to the emergence and recover from the socio-economic shock. UN resident coordinators worldwide will be the drivers of the UN response on the ground, ensuring that the wide and diverse expertise and assets of the United Nations system are used in the most efficient and effective way to support countries. Finally, when we get past this crisis, which we will face a choice. We can go back to the world as it was before, or deal decisively with those issues that make us all unnecessarily vulnerable to crisis. Our roadmap is the 2030 Agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The recovery from COVID-19 crisis must lead to a different economy. Everything we do during and after this crisis must be with a strong focus on building more equal, inclusive and sustainable economies and societies that are more resilient in the face of pandemics, climate change, and the many other global challenges we face. What the world needs now is solidarity. With solidarity, we can defeat the virus and build a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sir, a number of journalists are asking similar questions. The message you're delivering in this report is very similar to the message to the G20 leaders last week. What has been their response from President Trump, Angela Merkel, and others? And is there a financial goal for the COVID-19 recovery fund you are launching?
I think that the G20 was a step in the right direction, but I think we are still very far from where we need to be to effectively fight the COVID-19 worldwide and to be able to tackle the negative impacts on the global economy and the global societies. First,
that's the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres talking of the need to share responsibility to the impacts of the coronavirus. It was a call to action, he said. He talked of the prospect of the pandemic spreading like wildfire in the global south unless more is done, threatening millions. And it said that a large-scale multilateral response was required to the tune of 10% of global GDP. Let's bring in James Bays, who's listening in. And James, what did you make of what the Secretary General had to say?
It's the last thing you said, Nick, that the Secretary General said that I think is the key one. 10% of global GDP. That is a massive amount of money, is what the Secretary General now says needs to be mobilized to deal with the disease, but also the social and economic effects of the disease around the world, particularly in the most vulnerable communities around the world. Remember, this is on top of the Secretary General a week ago launching a $2 billion fund for the immediate humanitarian crisis. They are very concerned about those in conflict zones. They're very concerned about those living in refugee communities. It's worth noting that the UN Security Council has been meeting in recent days virtually. They had a meeting about Gaza. They had a meeting about Syria in the last few hours. They've been meeting about Afghanistan. And the message in all those places that the Security Council is getting is if some of these war-torn places were to get COVID-19, it's going to be so much worse than it would be in the developed world, which has so far taken the brunt, countries with more sophisticated medical systems. Let me just tell you one fascinating statistic that I saw in the last couple of hours from the Norwegian Refugee Council. It is telling us, there's this big push on in Italy, in the UK, the US to try and get ventilators. Well, in the Central African Republic, they have 5 million people. They don't have a big problem with COVID-19 yet. Though the shocking figure is that for 5 million people, they have just 3 ventilators.
That is just staggering and deeply concerning. James, appreciate your time. Thanks very much, James Bays there at UN headquarters.
Ask yourselves, people.
From New York, let's spin across the Atlantic to the United Kingdom, to Downing Street, and the UK's Cabinet Office Minister Michael Gove is speaking right now.
Devices to support affected patients, and a team from Oxford University are also developing related technology. And in our determination to prevent as many patients as possible seeing their condition worsen, we are conducting rapid clinical trials on those drugs, including anti-malarials, which may be able to reduce the impact of COVID-19 on those affected. But even as we seek to explore every avenue to slow the spread of the disease, to reduce its impact, and to save lives, I'm conscious of the sacrifices that so many are making. That's why the Chancellor's economic package is in place to support people through a difficult time. It's also why we're working so closely with our colleagues in the devolved administrations to coordinate our response across the United Kingdom, and I'm grateful to them, as I am to the thousands of dedicated public sector workers, cleaners and social workers, prison and police officers, those in the Royal Mail and in our schools. And I want to thank them, and also the leaders of the trade unions who represent them. In this united national effort, we're also delivering food and prescription drugs to up to 1.5 million of the most vulnerable, who are self-isolating for 3 months. And we will do more to help, working with the 750,000 people who volunteered to help at this time. Many are already heavily involved in local community support schemes. And we want to work with them to ensure that we support not just the 1.5 million most vulnerable to the disease, but all those who need our help through this crisis. Those without social support, those in tough economic circumstances, those who need the visible hand of friendship at a challenging time. That's why my Cabinet colleague George Eustice and the Food and Farming Minister Victoria Prentice will be leading work with food suppliers, retailers, local authorities and voluntary groups to support our neighbours in need. I also want to thank the men and women of the military who've stepped up their work as part of the ongoing response to coronavirus. 3 RAF Puma helicopters are now stationed at Kinloss Barracks in Murray. These Pumas are working closely with a Chinook and a Wildcat helicopter based at RAF Leeming in North Yorkshire to meet requests for assistance from NHS boards and trusts across Scotland and Northern England. A second helicopter facility covers the Midlands and Southern England, working out of the Aviation Task Force headquarters at RAF Benson in Oxfordshire. Chinook and Wildcat helicopters, normally based at RAF Odium and RNAS Yeovilton respectively, support the southern areas. And these helicopter facilities have been set up to support medical transport across Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. The task force is also available for general support, such as moving equipment and personnel to where they are needed across the United Kingdom. And the Kinloss-based support follows the use of an RAF A400M transport aircraft working with the Scottish Ambulance Service to evacuate a critically ill patient from the Shetland Islands to Aberdeen to receive intensive care treatment. I'm deeply grateful for everyone in the armed forces and in the public sector who are doing so much to help us in the fight against coronavirus. And of course, all of us can continue to play our part in supporting them and the health service by staying at home, supporting the NHS and saving lives.
That is the UK's Cabinet Office Minister, Michael Gove, talking of the sacrifices that so many people are making and thanking really the national effort to ease the strain, including 750,000 volunteers who elected to join in the effort to help things. Let's bring in Sonia Gallego, who's live for us from London via Skype. And Sonia, yes, indeed, Michael Gove there just emphasising the importance for everybody just joining together in this national effort to try and beat coronavirus.
Yes, that's right, Nick. I mean, he did pay tribute to all those volunteers, as you'd mentioned there, and also the military as well, who are helping to coordinate those efforts as well. For example, he just mentioned now how there are RAF helicopters stationed at different parts of the country in order to be able to give some help for medical mobilizations, including helping seriously ill patients to be able to be transported from islands located around the UK, the British Isles, as well. And he confirmed those numbers earlier on, the 25,150 confirmed cases and the jump of 381 deaths in the UK in the past 24 hours. Now, he also mentions that while there are some 8,000 ventilators within the NHS system now, which they have procured, they still need more ventilators and are going to other countries, including countries in the European Union, to try and get more into the national health system as they brace for this peak, which they believe is coming within 2 to 3 weeks' time as well. They're also going abroad outside of those EU nations as well to try and see what other aspects, what other pieces of equipment they are able to get in time for that sort of swell of patients which they are expecting at that point. Now, of course, they did mention they are getting help from with procuring parts of this from Ford and Airbus, etc., but also as well as the importance of finding a medical solution to the coronavirus epidemic as well. You mentioned that the University of Oxford as well was working on trying to find a cure for this, and that they are working and doing experimentations with drugs already, also an anti-malarial drug as well, in a bid to try and find some kind of cure to this as well. But looking ahead as well, I mean, there are also issues with trying to find the different components of the equipment that they need as well. And this is one challenge which they are going to be facing as they try to prepare for the patients, which thousands of patients which they're already preparing to receive in field hospitals, which they have been building up until now, Nick.
All right, Sonia, thanks very much indeed, Sonia Diego, there as with the ongoing press briefing from Downing Street with Michael Gove, the cabinet minister. Coronavirus deaths in the United States have exceeded the number of fatalities in China. The US now has a third highest death toll after Italy and Spain, with 3,393 people killed by the virus. With more cases than any other country, it's scrambling to build hundreds of temporary hospitals. New York State remains the worst affected area. A temporary hospital has been set up in New York City's Central Park as the search goes on nationwide for more potential sites. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo says the situation will get worse and that the state is preparing for a long fight.
We are planning now for the battle at the top of the mountain. That's what we are doing. Get a staffing plan ready now for the battle at the top of the mountain. Equipment stockpile now. We're gathering equipment that we don't need today because today is not the day of the battle. The battle is when we hit the apex, depending on who you believe, 14 days to 30 days from today.
Let's speak to Gabriel Elizondo, who joins me live from New Jersey. And every day we hear from Andrew Cuomo, and it's never a good picture. It's always disappointing news, as he put it himself.
Yeah, it really is. He painted a very gloomy picture of what is on the horizon for New York. The New York that you see right behind me, New York City, that continues to be the epicenter of this. A few of the latest numbers: more than 75,000 people in New York State now have coronavirus. That's up by about 9,000 in the last 24 hours. The vast majority of them from right there behind me, New York City. More than 43,000 of the 75,000 are in New York City. The death toll has climbed by more than 300 now. Now the death toll is a little over 1,500 just here in New York. This is the real thing that caught my eye at his briefing. He said there are 10,000 New Yorkers that are currently hospitalized with coronavirus. Out of those, he said, about 2,500 are in intensive care units, meaning they need urgent medical care. He said in the past that New York only has a capacity for about 3,000 intensive care units. So if they're already at 2,500, you can see how there is a real rush here, and they're racing against time to build out more hospital space, to get more hospital beds, because as Cuomo, the governor, said himself, they are still 2 weeks to maybe even a month away from reaching that real peak point. And in closing, I'll just say that right before Cuomo started giving his briefing, literally just a few minutes before, we got word that this is quite personal for the governor. His younger brother, Chris Cuomo, who's an acclaimed TV journalist in the United States, was confirmed to also have coronavirus himself. So this has now become personal for the New York governor as well, with his younger brother now as well with it.
Indeed it has. All right, Gabe, thanks very much. Gabriel Elizondo there in New York. The World Health Organization is calling on Asia-Pacific countries to stay vigilant in the fight against the pandemic. The warning comes amid further travel restrictions in Japan and another surge of infections in Singapore. Nearly 1,000 people in the city-state now have the virus. Florence Louis has this.
Wuhan, China, where the virus began, reported no new cases on Monday, its 7th day in a row. And nationwide, all the new cases reported were imported. But the World Health Organization warns, even for countries where the cases seem to be tapering off, this is not the time to let their guard down. Its regional director for Western Pacific, Takeshe Space, says countries will have to adopt multiple approaches: testing, isolating, and physical distancing to slow the spread of the virus.
Even with all of these measures, the risk will not go away as long as the pandemic continues. Rather, these measures can buy us valuable time to prepare for large-scale community transmission.
More countries are tightening restrictions. Japan has urged its citizens not to travel to 73 countries and regions, or a third of all countries in the world. Cases there have topped 2,000, with 2 clusters emerging in Tokyo over the past week. Last week, China banned foreigners from entering the country after seeing a rise in imported cases. In Hong Kong, residents who've returned from abroad are monitored to ensure they don't break quarantine rules.
The mobile app sends me notifications occasionally and asks me to take a photo of my arm with the wristband at my home, but I have no idea if anyone is really checking my response.
Malaysia, which imposed strict measures on movement and closed its borders to foreigners 2 weeks ago, will now require returning citizens to be quarantined at government centres instead of at home. New Zealand has extended a national state of emergency for another 7 days to provide the government powers and resources it needs to prevent the spread of coronavirus. Indonesia says it will ban all arrivals and transit by foreigners as the number of cases and deaths rise. No one knows how long the pandemic will last, but even after it's over, its impact will be felt for a long time. The World Bank's worst-case scenario estimates 11 million people in the region could be forced into poverty. Florence Louis, Al Jazeera.
To India, which is tracking down thousands of people who attended a gathering of Muslim leaders. Dozens of participants have since tested positive for coronavirus, and at least 10 have died. 700 have been sent to a quarantine centre, while hundreds more are in hospital. India is under lockdown, with people ordered to remain indoors until April the 15th. Elizabeth Puranam has more now from New Delhi.
We've still got buses taking people out of the mosque. Something like 1,000 people have been evacuated over the last 24 hours. At least 24 have tested positive. More than 400 have been showing symptoms and taken to hospital. More than 800 have been put in quarantine. And we know that 6 people who attended this religious gathering, 6 Indonesians, because there were people from all over India and other countries, 6 Indonesians who travelled after the gathering was finished from Delhi to the southern state of Telangana have since passed away, and so too has a Muslim cleric in Srinagar in Indian-administered Kashmir. So this has very much led to states around the country on a manhunt. Something like 6 regions have cases with direct links to the congregation. Half of the cases in the state of Telangana are linked to what happened. And so this is very much now being treated as a hotspot to try and find others in the country that could be vectors, people who attended and could now be vectors for the virus.
Now then, Pakistan doesn't yet have a significant rate of infections, but it's preparing for the worst. Kamal Haider has more from Islamabad.
A voluntary lockdown is in place in Pakistan. There is no transport moving, and that, of course, allowing people to move across into other provinces. The military is out in force also to ensure that they are able to make people adhere to that lockdown. Essential services, of course, are still operating. The country's Prime Minister announced that he would also be setting up a voluntary relief force which would be based on youth in order to confront this pandemic. The United Nations is also bracketing Pakistan amongst those vulnerable countries which could suffer badly if the breakout becomes a bigger issue. So far, the medical experts say that there has been no exponential growth of this COVID-19 outbreak here in Pakistan. They're watching the situation, and if that escalates, the country is already preparing to deal with a major crisis. The United Nations also says that developing countries like Pakistan, and that is about 170 countries around the world, would need over $2 trillion of aid in order to bring them out of an economic crisis which is now looming because of this global pandemic.
Now then, France, Germany and the United Kingdom have sent aid to Iran under a trade mechanism designed to avoid US sanctions. It is the first transaction under a new system set up for the exchange of humanitarian supplies and food after the United States withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran has just reported 141 new deaths, bringing its total to nearly 2,900. Nigeria has imposed a 2-week lockdown on 3 major states that are home to almost 30 million people. The streets of Lagos, as Africa's biggest city, are normally jammed with traffic, but were almost empty on Tuesday. Nigeria's president has ordered a cessation of all movement. The Lagos state government has launched a program to deliver food to 200,000 households during that time. A 14-day nationwide lockdown has come into effect in Uganda in an effort to slow the spread of the virus there. The president has already banned public transport, has closed the borders and urged people to stay at home. Uganda has 33 confirmed cases. Mexico has declared a public health emergency and has imposed a series of new measures aimed at slowing the spread of the virus. People over the age of 60, as well as those with pre-existing health conditions, have been told to stay at home. Mexico has more than 1,000 confirmed cases, with 28 deaths so far. The United Kingdom has begun testing a new breathing aid made in part by the Mercedes Formula One team to help coronavirus patients. The devices were developed in less than a week by a team of F1 engineers and doctors at University College London. The continuous positive airway pressure, or CPAP machines, deliver air and oxygen to a patient's lungs to help them breathe without needing to go on a ventilator.
Essentially, there is, as we know, a shortage of ventilators in the UK, and clearly if a patient needs to go on a ventilator, they're often needing to stay up to several weeks. So if we can have a bridge, a halfway house, where you need more than an oxygen mask, but less than an invasive ventilator, then hopefully many patients can be prevented from needing to go on to a ventilator.
So this is Al Jazeera. These are the top stories, and Spain has recorded its worst single-day death toll so far, with 849 fatalities in the past 24 hours. It is the fourth day in a row that Spain has reported more than 800 deaths. Over 94,000 people are infected. In Italy, flags are flying at half-mast, and a minute of silence has been observed to remember those who've died from coronavirus. Italy is the hardest-hit country, with more than 11,500 people dead and over 100,000 infected. Coronavirus deaths in the United States have exceeded the number of fatalities in China. The US now has the third highest death toll after Italy and Spain, with 3,393 people killed by the virus. With more cases than any other country, it's scrambling to build hundreds of temporary hospitals. New York State remains the worst affected area. The governor, Andrew Cuomo, says the situation will get worse, that the state is preparing for a long fight.
We are planning now for the battle at the top of the mountain. That's what we are doing. Get a staffing plan ready now for the battle at the top of the mountain. Equipment stockpile now. We're gathering equipment that we don't need today, because today is not the day of the battle. The battle is when we hit the apex, depending on who you believe, 14 days to 30 days from today.
India is tracking down thousands of people who attended a gathering of Muslim leaders. Dozens of participants have since tested positive for coronavirus, and at least 10 have died. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom have sent aid to Iran under a trade mechanism designed to avoid United States sanctions. It is the first transaction under a new system set up for the exchange of humanitarian supplies and food after the US withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal. Nigeria has imposed a 2-week lockdown on 3 major states that are home to almost 30 million people. Nigeria's president has ordered a cessation of all movement. The Lagos state government has launched a program to deliver food to 200,000 households during that time. You're up to date with headlines. Got more news here on Al Jazeera after Rewind, Born in Gaza.
As we started and we will end with its communities that will do this. There's no magic bullet. There's no magic vaccine or therapy. It's just behaviors. Each of our behaviors translating into something that changes the course of this viral pandemic over the next 30 days. Thank you.
She CDC and the director of the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Anthony Fauci, urged, as he put it, Americans to put their foot on the accelerator in terms of embracing the safe distancing guidelines that President Trump has outlined. And Vice President Mike Pence went further than anyone on that podium has gone before in suggesting that while these are described as 30 days of guidelines that the federal government has instituted, he and President Trump will be holding state governors accountable if they choose to depart from those guidelines. And that's one of the reasons why over the last 24 hours, right here in Washington, D.C., in fact, we've seen a much tougher approach being taken, a stay-at-home order being issued to people here. Also in neighboring Maryland and Virginia, the governor of Maryland saying that he is extremely worried that his state may be the next epicenter for coronavirus. Remember that of the deaths that have been recorded so far, around 25% have been seen in New York City. There is grave concern being expressed now by the president about the situation in Detroit and in Louisiana. Those may be hotspots we'll be focusing on soon.
All right, Simon, thank you very much for that update. Simon Marks reporting to us live from Washington, D.C.
And staying stateside, the closing numbers are in for the first quarter on Wall Street, and as you can expect, it certainly wasn't a pretty picture at all. Both the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 recorded their worst first quarter performance on record. The Dow dropping over 23% from the start of the year. The broader market S&P 500 declining more than 20% over the same period, which marks the index's sharpest decline since the 2008 global financial crisis. In the meantime, the Nasdaq fared slightly better, but not by a huge margin. It lost over 14%. And of course, I'll have the full read on the markets a little bit later on in the show.
And as countries grapple with a severe shortage of face masks in this age of the pandemic, the U.S. Center of Disease Control and also the World Health Organization have repeatedly stressed that only people with symptoms or those caring for them should wear a mask. But those guidelines may be changing. The CDC says it is reviewing its mask recommendations as a number of studies cited high rates of transmission from infected people who show no symptoms.
But some say that wearing surgical-type cotton masks may not protect healthy people from contracting the virus, and in fact could put them more at risk. Still, the CDC does not recommend N95 masks, the medical-grade ones that to filter out small particles and large droplets, saying that the limited supply of those masks should be reserved for healthcare workers. Meanwhile, the WHO stands by its assessment that there is no specific evidence to suggest that the wearing of masks by the mass population has any potential benefit.
You hear that, people?
Well, China will include asymptomatic cases of COVID-19 in their daily case count starting today. Now, the decision comes amid growing concern over the number of cases where the patient displays no symptoms but is positive for the virus. China has recorded around 1,500 such asymptomatic cases.
Well, officials say that they will tighten screening and quarantine rules targeting these infections, adding that health workers are now required to report them through the Central Communicable Disease Report System.
And upon discovery, patients and close contacts will be isolated for 2 weeks. Their quarantine will only be lifted after they've twice tested negative for the illness. So those who develop symptoms during isolation will become confirmed cases and undergo treatment.
Until now, asymptomatic cases have been excluded from China's official tally, raising questions about the true scale of the deadly pandemic.
Yeah, they're hiding shit.
Now, India and Pakistan have shut centers belonging to a Muslim missionary group on concern that it may be linked to one of South Asia's fastest emerging COVID-19 clusters.
Well, the group known as Tablighi Jamaat is one of India's oldest Islamic organizations with millions of followers worldwide. It's the same religious group that saw more than 1,000 positive COVID-19 cases come out of Kuala Lumpur after a 16,000-strong event 2 weeks ago. It has now come under fire again for flagrantly organizing multiple large-scale gatherings last month, despite government restrictions. In India, dozens of its followers have tested positive. 7 of them have died.
And meanwhile, at least 3 deaths in Pakistan have been linked to this group, while more than 140 have tested positive. Infections include citizens from neighboring countries in the region as well. Authorities are on a massive hunt to track down people who attended the events.
Well, taking a quick look at the COVID-19 figures in South Asia, Pakistan has the highest concentration of cases, past the 1900 mark, with a death toll of 26. And across the border in India has close to 1,400 cases, including 35 deaths, while Sri Lanka has more than 140 cases, and their death toll is currently at 2.
We're going for a short break now. Still ahead, business news is next with Adam. Adam, we're only 3 months into 2020, but what a wild ride it's been for the first quarter.
Yeah, gut-wrenching and quite head-spinning, no doubt. And of course, for US and Singapore stocks, it was their worst quarter since the global financial crisis. And I tell you what, it was even worse for oil. Major benchmarks saw their biggest losses in history. We'll look back at the quarter that was. But it doesn't end there, as the global economic growth is forecast to edge towards 0 this year.
As cities around the world go into lockdown, China is...
Updates this Wednesday morning. Well, it certainly was a historic first quarter for US stocks on Wall Street as investors wrapped up a period of unprecedented market volatility sparked by the coronavirus pandemic. The Dow Jones Industrial Average ended the quarter down more than 23%, marking its biggest first quarter loss on record. The S&P 500 index fell about 20%, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq Composite Index fared slightly better, but not great, losing about 14%. Well, zeroing in on the Dow right now, you'd have to go back all the way to 1987 during Black Monday to find a worse quarter for the index. And I use these words a lot, but looking at this chart, you can see just how volatile and unprecedented this period has been. Now, this quarter has seen the Dow reach its record high, fall into bear market territory in record time, and then start a new bull market again in record time. Big names on the Dow all falling quite heavily. Boeing, the industrial giant, lost about 54% in Q1. Exxon, the oil company, down over 45%. Similar, Pierre, Chevron, that lost 40%. And United Technologies dropping 37%. There was, in fact, only one stock, though, that gained on the index for the quarter, and that was Microsoft. It were closed up by less than 0.1%. Finally, let's check in on how the monthly performance looked across Wall Street. And as you guessed it, all the major indices closed in the red for their worst calendar month since 2008. Now, the Dow was the biggest decliner, down over 14% for the month, and for the first time in well over a decade, the S&P 500 benchmark has ended each of the first 3 months of the calendar year in negative territory. Well, the market's bloodbath in the first quarter has also spread to this part of the world. In fact, here in Singapore, the Straits Times Index, key index, fell about 23% in the first 3 months of this year, recording its worst quarterly performance since the October to December quarter of 2008. So the global financial crisis, pretty much. CNA's Henry Yen joins us with more from downtown Singapore. And Henry, going for what is the outlook for the Straits Times Index?
Yes, Adam, like you've mentioned, the benchmark STI closed higher yesterday, but it still cannot prevent the benchmark from logging its worst quarterly performance since the 2008 global financial crisis. And the stock market actually is not the only one who staged a deja vu of the 2008 financial crisis. We're also seeing that global fiscal stimulus as well as aggressive rate cuts launched by the global central banks that are reminiscent to those concerted efforts launched by global central banks during the 2008 global financial crisis. And if you'll recall, those stimulus packages actually have prevented a global market plunge during the global financial crisis, which then swung into broad sideways in the following months. And now, DBS equity research analysts are seeing similar movement for the benchmark STI's development in the future months. So basically, we're expecting to see the benchmark index in a range of around 2,300 to 2,600 in the coming month. And analysts also say it could fall to around 2,050 points before finally bottoming out in the following months. Of course, with the panic selling as well as marginal selling halted for now, analysts are saying that three COVID-19 related themes that are actually standing out amid the market turbulence. So first of all, those survivors, these are referring to those companies that have very good cash flow and low gearings and earnings visibility, such as SGX and A-REIT, Wilmar and Mint. And of course, secondly, refers to those companies with very resilient ability to fight against the short-term supply chain disruption, as well as sudden drop in consumer spending, such as StarHub and Netlink, Dairy Farm Shenzhen and Manulife. Of course, the last category would be those companies can actually benefit from the recovery of China, such as CapitaLand, as well as Yangtzejiang Shipbuilding. Adam?
All right, Henry, thanks for breaking it down for us. Of course, we have to keep a very close eye on those names you just mentioned as we are in the beginnings of the second quarter for 2020. Well, moving on, the past 3 months have also been rather devastating, as you can imagine, for oil prices. It logged its worst quarter and worst month ever. West Texas Intermediate fell overnight by 1.3%. We saw Brent down breaking even pretty much with some downside, but they've been hammered over the last few days. Both contracts so far have lost 65% since the beginning of the year, hovering at around an 18-year low. So you have to go all the way back to 2002. Let's zoom in on U.S. crude oil, though. It opened the year at around $61 a barrel at the start. Now, pressure began in the last week of January when China began shutting down the economy and to try and curb the spread of the coronavirus. Now, things took a turn for the worse in early March. That was when prices crashed by as much as 34% in a single day. And that was when Russia and Saudi Arabia basically triggered a price war, locking heads over the extension of the output curbs as the COVID-19 pandemic pushed demand to a virtual standstill. Now, this sent prices down a spiral pretty much, with crude oil briefly dipping below the $20 mark on March the 30th. And analysts say that things can only get worse from this point on. Starting today, global oil producers are on an output free-for-all. Now, that's after OPEC's plus 3-year-old deal, which withheld 2.1 million barrels of oil production, and that expired yesterday. Now, the oil titans are threatening to flood the already inundated markets with supply. Saudi Arabia, one of the biggest marginal producer in OPEC, is looking to boost output by 600,000 barrels per day to hit a record high of 10.6 million barrels per day. Russia, the other next biggest producer, has earlier said that it can also ramp up production by up to 500,000 barrels per day. Well, with the faltering stock and oil markets, global growth is now set to fall towards zero. S&P Global Ratings has downgraded its forecasts, saying that worldwide economic turbulence wrought by the coronavirus crisis and nationally enforced lockdowns are the culprits for the dire situation. The ratings agency is marking global growth down to 0.4% this year due to the steep decline in activity worldwide.